Before we continue, like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more in the future. And write in the comments where you are listening from. I love reading all the comments. Let's begin. Our journey into the world of Albert Camus begins not in the dusty lecture halls of Paris, but under the brilliant and often a brutal sun of French Algeria. To understand Camus the philosopher, one must first understand Camus the man, a man whose entire worldview was forged not in abstract speculation, but in the crucible of a specific time, a specific place, and a specific set of lived and a deeply felt experiences. His philosophy is a philosophy of the flesh, a thought that is rooted in the body, in the landscape, and in the overwhelming sensual reality of the Mediterranean world. He was born in 1913 in Mondovi, Algeria, into a world of intense poverty. His father, a poor agricultural worker, passed away from wounds sustained in the First World War, when Camus was less than a year old, leaving him to be raised by his mother, a gentle and an almost completely silent, illiterate cleaning woman, and a stern, domineering grandmother. His childhood was one of sunburn, of dusty streets, and of a poverty so absolute that it was not a source of shame, but was simply the natural condition of his existence. This early poverty was not for Camus a source of resentment, but was in a strange and a profound way a kind of gift. It taught him a deep and an abiding respect for the simple physical realities of life. It stripped away all illusions, all pretensions, and it left him with a powerful connection to the fundamental truths of the body, the truth of hunger, the truth of exhaustion, and the profound simple joy of a cool drink of water on a hot day. It was his first and his most important philosophical education. And surrounding this world of human poverty was a world of immense and almost a divine natural wealth, the world of the Algerian coast, with its brilliant, unforgiving sun, its vast blue and an indifferent sea, and its vibrant, teeming street life. This landscape became the very soul of his work. He was, first and last, a man in love with the sun, a pagan spirit who found his only church on the beaches, his only scripture in the rhythm of the waves, and his only God in the brilliant, life-giving and sometimes a death-dealing power of the sun. This passionate and this almost a physical love for the world is the first great pillar of his entire philosophy. Unlike so many of the European thinkers who saw the material world as a fallen place, a prison for the soul, Camus saw it as the only paradise we will ever know. His morality, his politics, and his entire vision of a good life are all grounded in this profound and this almost a holy attachment to the simple sensual beauty of the earth, a beauty that is made all the more precious by its fleeting and its mortal nature. But his young life was not just one of sun and of poverty, it was also defined by a third and a more shadowy presence, the presence of illness. At the age of 17, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that would haunt him for the rest of his life and which in that era was often a death sentence. This early, and this intimate, confrontation with his own mortality gave him a profound and a deeply personal understanding of the fragility of human happiness, and of the absurd and the meaningless nature of suffering. It was this unique combination of experiences that shaped the man, the poverty that taught him the value of the real, the sun and the sea that taught him the beauty of the world, and the illness that taught him the absurdity of his own existence. He was a man who understood in his very bones both the profound glory and the profound tragedy of being alive, and it was from this tension, from this love of life in the very face of its meaninglessness, that his entire philosophy would be born. He became a brilliant student, a passionate soccer player, a journalist, a playwright, and a novelist. He was a man who loved life, who loved people, and who threw himself into the great political and moral dramas of his time. From the Spanish Civil War to the French resistance against the Nazis, he was not a philosopher who lived in an ivory tower. He was a man of action, a moralist, a conscience for a generation that had lived through the darkest and the most nihilistic of all possible centuries. His philosophy, therefore, is not a system in the traditional sense. It is not a grand abstract and an all-encompassing theory like that of a Kant or a Hegel. It is, instead, a series of profound and of deeply honest reflections on a single fundamental problem, the problem of how to live a good, a just, and a meaningful life in a universe that offers no ultimate meaning, no divine purpose, and no final judgment. It is a philosophy for mortals, a philosophy for a world without God. And so, we see the great central themes of his entire life's work already present in his Algerian childhood. The sun, which represents the pure, innocent, and a deeply joyful love of the physical world, and the plague, the tuberculosis, which represents the absurd, the meaningless, and the ever-present reality of suffering and of death. His entire philosophy will be a heroic and a lifelong attempt to hold both of these truths in his mind at the same time, to not let the reality of the plague extinguish his love for the sun. He is the great philosopher of the no, the man who looks at the silent, indifferent universe and refuses to surrender to its meaninglessness, but he is also, and more importantly, the great philosopher of the yes, the man who, in the very midst of that silent universe, looks at the beauty of a single human face, at the warmth of the sun on his skin, and at the vast blue expanse of the sea, and who says a profound, a courageous, and a deeply joyful yes to the tragic and the beautiful and the absurd gift of life itself. This is the man, this is the world, and this is the struggle that we will explore in our journey. The journey of a soul that found its truth not in the dusty pages of old books, but in the brilliant and the unforgiving light of the Algerian sun, a light that illuminates both the breathtaking beauty of our world and the profound and the silent absurdity of our place within it. We have now met the man, Albert Camus, a soul forged in the crucible of Algerian sun and of shadow, of poverty and of beauty, a man whose entire being was animated by a profound and an almost a physical love for this world, and it is from this deep and this almost a pagan love of life that his entire philosophy begins. It begins not with a complex and an abstract metaphysical system, but with a single, a direct, and a deeply personal question he called the one and the only, truly serious philosophical problem. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, he writes in the opening lines of his great essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, and that is suicide. With this shocking and a powerful statement, he cuts through all the abstract debates of the past and goes directly to the heart of the matter. Before we can ask how we should live, before we can talk about justice or virtue or the good, we must first answer the more fundamental question, whether life is worth living at all. And for Camus, this question arises from a specific, a powerful, and a deeply modern feeling, the feeling of the absurd. To understand Camus, it is absolutely crucial to understand what he means by this word, the absurd. It is not, as is often misunderstood, a property of the world itself. The world for Camus is not absurd, it is simply and profoundly unreasonable. It is a place of breathtaking beauty and of senseless suffering. It operates not according to our human logic, it offers no final answers, it has no inherent purpose. It simply and silently is. The universe is not hostile. It is merely indifferent, and man in himself is not absurd either. On the contrary, the one single thing that defines the human being is a deep, a passionate, and a constant longing for meaning, for clarity, for unity, for a rational explanation that can make sense of his existence. The human heart is a creature that is perpetually crying out for a reason, for a purpose, for a sign that its life is not just a meaningless accident. It is a call that echoes through the silence of the cosmos. The absurd, then, is not in man, and it is not in the world. It is born from the confrontation between the two. It is the unbridgeable gap, the tragic divorce between the meaning-seeking human and the silent, meaningless universe. It is the clash between our desperate need for a why and the universe's absolute and an eternal refusal to provide one. The absurd is not a state of being, it is a relationship, the only true relationship between our minds and the world around us. This feeling, Camus says, can strike us at any moment. It is the feeling that arises when the stage scenery of our daily lives suddenly collapses. We go through the motions, rising, tramway, 4 hours in the office, meal, tramway, 4 hours in the office, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, on the same rhythm, but then one day, the great and a terrible question, why, arises. And in that moment of weariness and of astonishment, the absurd is born. It is the feeling of being a stranger in a familiar land, an exile in your own life. It is the sudden recognition of time as a destructive and a terrifying force, a river that is carrying us, day by day, towards the ultimate absurdity of our own annihilation. It is the feeling of the density and the strangeness of the natural world, of looking at a tree or a stone and realizing that it is a fundamentally alien thing, a reality that has nothing to say to us and nothing in common with us. From a utilitarian perspective, this confrontation with the absurd is a painful but a necessary crisis. A life that is lived on the basis of unexamined habits and of false, ungrounded hopes is a life of very low quality and a very fragile utility. The shock of the absurd, while causing the short-term suffering of disillusionment, is ultimately beneficial because it clears away these comforting fictions and allows for the construction of a new, a more resilient, and a more authentic form of human well-being. It is the painful but a necessary first step in the therapy of the soul. Once we have become truly and fully conscious of our absurd condition, once we have looked our meaningless fate directly in the eye, we are then faced with a fundamental choice. Camus argues that there are three possible responses to this great confrontation, and the first, and the most obvious, is physical suicide. If life has no meaning, then why continue to endure it? But Camus, the great lover of life, rejects this option. To end one's own life, he argues, is to surrender to the absurd. It is to confess that life is not worth living. It is an act of escape, not of defiance. The second, and a more subtle, response is what he calls philosophical suicide, or the leap of faith. This is the path of religion and of other, more theological forms of existentialism. It is the act of trying to escape the anxiety of the absurd by leaping to a belief in God, in an afterlife, or in some other, transcendent and an ultimate meaning. For Camus, this is an act of intellectual dishonesty. It is an attempt to heal the wound of the absurd by pretending that one side of the equation, the silent, unreasonable universe, does not exist. To make the leap of faith is to betray the very truth that your own, honest reason has revealed to you. It is to trade a difficult but an honest state of rebellion for a comfortable but an ultimately an illusory state of submission. It is, in the end, just another, more sophisticated and a more philosophical form of escape, and Camus, above all else, insists that we must live without escape, that we must face our condition with a clear, a courageous, and an unwavering honesty. This leaves only one, true and an authentic response, the only path that is worthy of a truly conscious human being. We must live with the absurd, we must keep it alive, we must refuse all the temptations of a false hope. This means holding both terms of the great contradiction constantly in our minds, to be forever conscious of our own passionate desire for meaning, and at the very same time of the world's absolute and its final refusal to provide it. This state of permanent, of conscious, and of a defiant confrontation with the meaninglessness of our own existence is what Camus calls rebellion. To live in a state of rebellion is to find our truth not in any answer, but in the constant and the passionate tension of the question itself. It is to live without appeal to any higher power or any future promise, and it is to find our entire world, our entire meaning, and our entire freedom in the magnificent, the tragic, and the beautiful struggle of the present moment, a struggle that gives rise to its own, unique, and a deeply human set of values. We have now stood with Albert Camus at the great dizzying precipice of the absurd. We have looked into the abyss of a meaningless universe and have, like him, refused the twin temptations of escape. The physical escape of suicide and the philosophical escape of a leap of faith. We have chosen the third and the only authentic path. The path of rebellion, the path of living in a constant, a conscious, and a defiant confrontation with our own meaningless fate. But what does it actually mean to live this way? What are the practical and the living consequences of this rebellion? Camus's answer is that the moment we truly and fully accept the absurd, the moment we abandon all hope for an eternal meaning or a future salvation, we are granted a strange, a new, and a profound kind of freedom. He argues that the ordinary man, the man who lives with a belief in a future or a purpose, is not truly free. He is a slave to his own hopes. He is constantly sacrificing the present for the sake of a future that may never come. He is always judging his actions based on a set of external rules or a divine plan. His life is a means to an end. But the absurd man, The man who knows there is no future beyond the grave and no external rules to guide him is liberated from this slavery. His life is no longer a means to an end, his life is the end. Every single moment is stripped of its connection to any grand cosmic plan and is therefore returned to him in its pure, its raw, and its magnificent immediacy. This, for Camus, is the first great consequence of the absurd, a profound and a deeply liberating freedom. It is a freedom from the burden of hope and a freedom for the experience of the present moment. The absurd man is not interested in living forever. He is interested in living as much as possible. This leads to the second great consequence of the absurd, passion. If this life is the only one we have, if there is no eternal reward, then the goal is no longer to live the best life in the eyes of some non-existent judge. The goal is to live the most life, to accumulate the greatest possible quantity of experiences, to feel with the greatest possible intensity. The absurd man is a passionate collector of moments. He understands that a life of 30 years, lived with a conscious and a passionate awareness, is a far richer and a far more valuable life than a life of 80 years, lived in the dull unthinking routine of a man who is always waiting for his real life to begin tomorrow. It is a call to a passionate and almost a sensual engagement with the world, a call to say yes to every single fleeting and a beautiful experience that this life has to offer. And the third, and the final, consequence is revolt. This is not a political revolution, but a metaphysical one. It is the constant, the conscious, and the deeply personal act of keeping the absurd alive, of saying no to all the comforting illusions that try to obscure our true condition. It is the defiant energy of a condemned man who, knowing his fate is sealed, chooses to live out his final days with a passionate and a joyful and an unshakable dignity. This revolt is the very thing that gives his life its grandeur and its meaning. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a powerful and a deeply practical formula for human well-being. By abandoning the painful and an often a futile search for an ultimate external meaning, and by relocating the source of value in the passionate, the free, and the rebellious experience of the individual, Camus provides a roadmap to a flourishing life that is completely independent of any metaphysical or a religious belief. It is a way of maximizing the utility of our one and our only life, by focusing on the quality and the quantity of our lived experience. To illustrate this new kind of hero, the man who lives by these three principles of freedom, passion, and revolt, Camus gives us several examples. The first is the Don Juan, the great seducer. He is not a man who is searching for a single true love, for in an absurd world there is no such thing. Instead, he is a man who seeks to multiply his passionate experiences. He loves each woman he is with completely and totally, for that moment, without any thought of a future or of an eternity. He is not a cynical libertine, he is a generous lover of life. A man who knows that a passion and a fleeting encounter is more valuable than a lifetime of lukewarm devotion. Another example is the actor. The actor is a man who for 3 hours on a stage lives 100 different lives. He knows that none of them are real, that the stage is just a temporary illusion, but he throws himself into each role with a total and a passionate commitment. He is the master of the fleeting, the ephemeral. He embodies the absurd truth that our own lives are also a kind of temporary performance on a cosmic stage, and that the meaning is to be found not in the final outcome, but in the passion of the performance itself. And the final, and the most powerful, of these heroes is the conqueror, the historical adventurer, the man who throws himself into the great and the often a violent drama of his own time. He knows that his actions will ultimately be forgotten, that all the kingdoms of the world will eventually turn to dust. But he chooses to act anyway, to pit his own single will against the chaos of history. He finds his meaning not in some final lasting victory, but in the glorious and the tragic struggle itself. All of these figures, the seducer, the actor, the conqueror, are heroes of the absurd because they are all living lives of pure and of unadulterated expenditure. They are not trying to save, to hoard, or to invest their lives for some future return. They are spending their one precious and a finite resource, their time. With a magnificent and a joyful and a completely reckless abandon, they are burning their candles at both ends, and in doing so, are creating a brilliant if a fleeting light in a dark and a silent universe. This, then, is the liberating and the deeply challenging consequence of the absurd, It is a philosophy that frees us from the chains of a non-existent future and returns us with a passionate and a joyful intensity to the only reality we will ever know, the reality of the present moment. It is a call to live our lives, not as a cautious and a fearful pilgrim on a journey to a distant and an imaginary holy land, but as a passionate, a free and a rebellious king in the small, the fleeting, and the magnificent kingdom of our own immediate experience. We have now explored the core of Albert Camus's philosophy, the absurd confrontation between our desire for meaning and the universe's silence, and we have seen the consequences of embracing this truth, a life of freedom, of passion, and of revolt. But to bring this entire vision together, to give it its final, most powerful, and most unforgettable image, Camus turns to the ancient world of Greek mythology, and in a brilliant act of philosophical reimagining, he gives us his ultimate hero, the perfect embodiment of the absurd, the figure of Sisyphus. The myth is a simple and a brutal one. Sisyphus, for his various crimes against the gods, for his profound and a deeply rebellious love for life on this earth, was condemned to a unique and a particularly cruel punishment. He was tasked with pushing a great boulder up a mountain, and just as his struggle was about to reach the summit, the rock by its own immense weight would roll all the way back down to the bottom, and he was condemned by the gods to repeat this futile, this hopeless, and this completely meaningless labor for all of eternity. Sisyphus, Camus tells us, is the absurd hero. And he is a hero not just for the passions that led him to this fate, but primarily for the very nature of his punishment. For his endless, his pointless, and his repetitive struggle is a perfect metaphor for the human condition. We too are Sisyphus. We are the modern worker who spends every day performing the same tasks, only to return the next morning to begin the cycle all over again. Our entire lives are spent pushing our own boulders, our own small and our own ultimately futile projects towards a summit that we will never permanently reach. For the great and the undeniable end of all our striving is death, the moment when the boulder once and for all rolls back down to the bottom of the hill. If we look at our lives from a cosmic and an honest perspective, a perspective that is stripped of all our comforting illusions, we are all engaged in a Sisyphean labor, a brief and an ultimately a pointless struggle in a universe that is completely indifferent to our efforts. This is the tragic and the absurd truth of our condition. But it is precisely in the conscious acceptance of this terrible truth that Camus finds a strange, a powerful, and a deeply hopeful form of victory. He says that the most interesting and the most important part of the entire myth is not the struggle up the mountain, but the moment after the rock is rolled back down. It is the pause, the breath, the hour of consciousness, when Sisyphus walks back down the slope to retrieve his stone. In that moment, as he descends, he is completely and lucidly aware of the full extent of his miserable condition. It is during that return, that pause, Camus writes, that Sisyphus interests me. For in that moment of clear-sighted and of hopeless consciousness, Sisyphus is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. A rock that is pushed by a blind, a mechanical and an unthinking force is just a rock. But a man who knows that his task is futile and who chooses to push the rock anyway is a man who has transformed his punishment into his own personal project. His lucidity, his consciousness of the absurd, is the very source of his tragic grandeur. This is where the victory of the absurd hero lies. His victory is not in escaping his fate, for there is no escape. His victory is in his rebellion against it. He rebels not by trying to break his chains, but by his scorn for the gods who chained him. They intended this eternal and this pointless labor to be a terrible punishment. But his conscious acceptance of it, his refusal to be broken by it, robs the punishment of its power. He has taken their meaningless task, and he has filled it with his own defiant meaning. The struggle itself becomes enough to fill his heart. And this leads Camus to the final, the most radical, the most beautiful, and the most famous line in his entire essay, a conclusion that serves as the ultimate and the most life-affirming answer to the problem of nihilism. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, he writes. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This is a breathtaking and a revolutionary idea. Happiness is not to be found in some future paradise, or in the successful completion of some grand, cosmic purpose. Happiness can be found here, now, in the midst of a pointless and an eternal struggle. This is the ultimate formula for creating well-being in a universe that offers none. Sisyphus, by transforming a state of what should be maximum suffering, a pointless, eternal punishment, into a state of happiness, performs a miracle of utility. He proves that happiness is not a condition of the world, but is an attitude of the mind, a choice, a rebellion, and therefore it is something that is always within our power. He has created a profound and a meaningful existence out of the raw and the chaotic materials of meaninglessness itself. Sisyphus is happy because he has abandoned all hope for a transcendent future, and in doing so, he has become the true master of his own days. His fate belongs to him, his rock is his thing, and his happiness is the grim, the defiant, the deeply won joy that comes from looking at the absurdity of his condition and choosing to love it anyway. It is the ultimate expression of Nietzsche's amor fati, the love of one's fate, but it is a more democratic, a more accessible version of love that is available not just to the superhuman overman, but to any person willing to live with their eyes open. The wisdom of the absurd, then, is not a philosophy of despair, but one of a difficult and a courageous joy. It is the recognition that the universe is, and always will be, silent, but that our own hearts are full of a passionate, a rebellious, and a creative life. Camus does not try to solve the absurd. He does not try to explain away the meaninglessness of the world. He invites us to live in it, to embrace it, and to find our freedom and our happiness in it. Sisyphus teaches us that the meaning of our life is not some grand prize waiting for us at the top of the mountain. The meaning of our life is the struggle itself. It is the conscious, the lucid, and the passionate effort we put into pushing our own unique boulder up our own unique mountain day after day, and that in this struggle, in this rebellion, in this profound and defiant love for our own tragic and beautiful fate, we can find a happiness so powerful and so profound that even the gods themselves cannot take it away from us. If the myth of Sisyphus is the great philosophical essay that lays out the theory of the absurd, then Albert Camus's masterpiece, the novel The Stranger, is its living, breathing, and a deeply unsettling, fictional embodiment. It is here that we move from the abstract arguments of the philosopher to the concrete, lived reality of a single human being. It is here that we meet the ultimate absurd hero, not as a king of ancient Greece, but as a simple and almost an anonymous shipping clerk living under the brilliant and the unforgiving sun of modern Algiers. His name is Meursault. Meursault is one of the most enigmatic and most controversial characters in all of modern literature, and he is the perfect portrait of the absurd man before the moment of conscious rebellion. He is a man who lives in a state of perfect, almost a holy harmony with the absurd nature of the world. But he does so not as a philosopher, but as a simple and a profoundly honest creature of sensation. His story is a journey from a state of unconscious, innocent absurdity to a final and a conscious and a defiant embrace of his own fate. The first half of the novel is a portrait of a life lived completely and totally in the present moment. Meursault's entire world is the world of the physical, of the sensory. He is acutely aware of the heat of the sun on his skin, of the cool relief of the sea, of the taste of coffee and of cigarettes, of the simple physical pleasure of being with his lover, Marie. His consciousness is a clean, polished mirror that simply reflects the immediate, physical reality of the world around him, without judgment, without interpretation, without any need for a deeper meaning. He is a man who is a stranger to the very concepts of a past and a future. He feels no regret for what has been, and he has no grand ambitions or hopes for what is to come. When his boss offers him a promotion and a new life in Paris, a chance that any normal man would leap at, Meursault responds with a simple and a deeply honest indifference. It doesn't really matter, he says. One life is as good as another. He has no story, no narrative that he is trying to impose upon his own existence. He simply and profoundly, from a utilitarian perspective, Meursault's life is a strange and a paradoxical one. On the one hand, he exists in a state of almost perfect, simple contentment. He is free from the great sources of human suffering, the anxiety about the future, the guilt about the past, the desperately often a painful search for a higher meaning. His is a life of simple and of easily attainable pleasures, a state of very high, if very shallow, personal utility. But this same detachment makes him a profoundly unreliable member of the social world. His indifference prevents him from forming the deep, compassionate bonds that are necessary for a flourishing community. The novel opens with its famously blunt and a deeply shocking first line, "Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know." This is our introduction to Meursault's most defining and most alienating characteristic, his radical, almost a pathological, honesty. He does not feel the deep and the socially expected grief at his mother's passing, and so he does not pretend to. At her funeral, he does not weep. He is simply tired. He is bothered by the heat, and he is more interested in the details of the ceremony than in the grand emotion of the event. He refuses to perform the lie that society demands of him. This radical honesty extends to all of his relationships. His lover, the beautiful and a vibrant Marie, asks him if he loves her, and he replies, with a simple and an almost a gentle truthfulness, that the question didn't mean anything, but that he supposed not. When she asks if he wants to marry her, he says that it makes no difference to him, but that they can if it would make her happy. He refuses to play the great, and the often a deeply dishonest game of romantic love. He enjoys her, he desires her, but he will not say the words that society expects him to say, because he does not feel them. He drifts into a friendship with his neighbor, a pimp and a petty criminal named Raymond Sintès. Not out of any deep affection or a shared set of values, but simply because it happens. Raymond asks him to write a letter to help humiliate a former mistress, and Meursault agrees, not out of malice but out of a simple and a passive indifference. It is easier for him to say yes than it is to say no. He is a man who floats through life, a creature of pure passivity, a stranger to his own actions, which seem to happen to him rather than being chosen by him. It is this refusal to lie, this refusal to play the social games that we all, consciously or unconsciously, play every single day to make our lives feel meaningful and coherent, that makes him a stranger. An outsider. In his own world, he is not an evil man. He is simply a man who is living in perfect and in harmonious accord with what Camus sees as the fundamental truth of the universe. The truth of a profound, a deep, and a tender indifference. He is a living mirror that reflects back to society its own hypocrisy, its own sentimentality, and its own comforting but ultimately a baseless illusions. And it is for this that society will, in the end, condemn him. Not for the terrible act he is about to commit, but for the much more profound and the much more unforgivable crime of not playing the game, of not weeping at his mother's funeral, of being a man who lives without a story, a man who is a walking, breathing embodiment of the absurd truth that the rest of us spend our entire lives trying to deny, a truth that is as brilliant, as powerful, and as indifferent as the Algerian sun itself. Meursault, in this first half of the novel, is the absurd man, but he is an absurd man who is not yet conscious of his own absurdity. He is a kind of innocent, a man living in a state of nature, a pre-fall Adam in a godless Garden of Eden. He is not yet in a state of rebellion, because he has not yet been truly confronted by the abyss that separates his own simple, honest soul from the meaning-demanding and the deeply dishonest world of other men. This state of passive and of innocent absurdity is about to be shattered. It will be shattered by a moment of meaningless violence, by the flash of a knife, and by the blinding and the unforgiving light of the sun on a hot and a deserted beach. It is an event that will finally and irrevocably awaken him from his long sensory dream, and it will force him into a final and a conscious confrontation with the absurd and with the world that will demand that he justify an existence that has no justification. We have now seen the world through the eyes of Meursault, a world of pure, unmediated sensation, a life lived in a state of passive and an unconscious harmony with the absurd. But this state of innocent and of a moral grace cannot last. The absurd man, to become a true hero, must not just live the absurd, he must become conscious of it. And that consciousness is almost always born from a moment of crisis, a moment of rupture, a moment when the silent indifference of the world and the strange indifference of his own heart collide in a single, inexplicable and a tragic act of violence. The stage for this great confrontation is a hot and a sun-drenched Sunday on a beach outside Algiers. Meursault, his lover Marie, and his questionable friend Raymond are spending the day at the beach house of one of Raymond's friends. It is a day of simple physical pleasures, of swimming in the cool water, of napping in the hot sun, of a good lunch with plenty of wine. It is the world that Meursault understands, and the world in which he is most at home, a world of pure and of unthinking, physical sensation. But this simple, pagan paradise is disturbed by a shadow from Raymond's sordid past. Two Arab men, one of whom is the brother of the mistress that Raymond had beaten, are following them. There is a brief, tense confrontation on the beach. A scuffle, and Raymond is slashed with a knife. The conflict is petty. It is pointless. It is born from a sordid affair that Meursault has no real stake in, but he has, through his own passive indifference, become entangled in its logic. A logic that is now escalating towards a tragic and an unnecessary conclusion. After the initial fight, the tension seems to dissipate, but Meursault, instead of staying in the cool shade of the beach house, feels an inexplicable urge to walk back down to the beach alone. He is not angry. He is not seeking revenge. He is simply drawn, as if by a physical force, back towards the scene of the conflict. The true and the central actor in this scene is not a human emotion. It is the sun, the very same sun that Meursault has always loved, the sun that has always been a source of simple, joyful, and of physical pleasure. But now, on this day, the sun has become a monstrous and an oppressive and a hostile force. Camus's description of the heat is almost a physical assault on the reader. The sun is a blinding rain, the sea is a hot, metallic breath, the sand is scorching, and the light is a dazzling spear that stabs at Meursault's eyes. It is a world that has become suddenly and overwhelmingly hostile and alien. It is the physical manifestation of the indifferent universe pressing down upon him. He finds one of the Arab men, the one with the knife, resting in the cool shadow of a large rock by a spring. The man is not a threat. He is simply trying to escape the oppressive heat. But for Meursault, in his sun-dazed and a half-drunken state, this entire scene feels like a confrontation. The heat, the light, the shimmering air, all of it seems to be conspiring to push him forward. He feels a strange and a powerful pressure on his body and on his mind, a physical force that is driving him towards an action he does not understand. He has Raymond's revolver in his pocket, which he had taken earlier to prevent further trouble. The Arab man, seeing him approach, shows his knife. A glint of sunlight reflecting off the blade, and that single sharp flash of light is the final and the decisive event. The light shot off the steel. Meursault narrates, and it was like a long flashing blade lunging at my forehead. In that instant, his entire being, overwhelmed by the oppressive force of the sun and by the sharp stabbing pain of the light, reacts. He is not thinking. He is not feeling hatred. He is not making a choice in the way that we would normally understand it. His body, his senses, his entire physical being simply reacts against the overwhelming and the almost a physical assault of the sun. My whole being tensed, he says, and I squeezed my hand around the revolver. The trigger gives way, and the loud, sharp report of the shot shatters the silence of the beach. It is a single, a decisive, and a completely meaningless act, a moment of pure and of unthinking, physical reaction. But he does not stop there. After that first, and that fatal shot, he pauses, and then he fires 4 more times into the inert body. This is the great and the enduring mystery of the novel. Why the 4 extra shots? They are not necessary for self-defense. They are not born of passion. They are, Camus seems to suggest, a kind of knocking, 4 short, sharp knocks on the door of misfortune. It is as if in that moment Meursault is not just reacting against the sun, he is consciously and deliberately shattering the peaceful and the unconscious dream of his own life. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a moment of catastrophic disutility, a single senseless act, born not of malice, but of a profound and a sun-drenched indifference, has destroyed one life and has irrevocably condemned another. It produces no good, no happiness, only a future of imprisonment and of immense suffering. It is the ultimate proof that a life lived without a conscious and a social, moral framework, a life of pure unthinking and an immoral sensation, is a profound and a dangerous liability, not just for the individual but for the entire community. This single, absurd act on the beach is the great turning point of the novel. It is the moment that ends the first half of the book. the story of the unconscious and the absurd man, and it is the event that will trigger the second half, the story of the conscious and the absurd rebel. Mirso, the man who has lived his entire life as a stranger to himself, is about to be arrested, to be put on trial, and to be forced, for the very first time, to try and explain an action that has no explanation and to justify a life that has no justification. He has, up until now, lived in a state of innocent harmony with the indifferent world, but in firing those 5 shots, he has now declared war on the one thing he has never had to confront, the world of other people, the world of society, a world that cannot and will not tolerate the silent and the amoral and the absurd truth of his own singular existence. His long and his peaceful and his sun-drenched dream is now over, and he is about to awaken into the bright, the harsh, and the unforgiving light of human judgment. The 5 sharp reports of the revolver on the sun-drenched beach have shattered the quiet and the passive and the unconscious world of Mirso. He has committed an act, and he must now enter a new and an alien world, a world not of physical sensation, but of human judgment, a world of lawyers, of magistrates, and of courtrooms. The second half of The Stranger is the story of Mirso's trial. But it is not a trial to determine his guilt or his innocence in a legal sense. It is a trial of his very soul, a desperate and ultimately a success attempt by society to execute a man not for what he did, but for who he is. From the very beginning of his imprisonment and his legal proceedings, Mirso is a stranger, an outsider to his own story. He listens with a kind of detached and a mild curiosity as the lawyers and the magistrates construct a narrative, a story about him that he does not recognize. They are not interested in the truth of the event, in the sun, in the heat, in the flash of the knife. They are interested in creating a story that makes sense, a story that has a clear motive, a clear moral, and a clear villain, and to do this, they must invent a Mirso who does not exist. The great central focus of the prosecution is not the act on the beach, but Mirso's behavior at his mother's funeral. The prosecutor, in his closing arguments, spends more time talking about the fact that Mirso did not cry at the funeral than he does about the actual event for which he is on trial. He argues that a man who does not weep at his own mother's funeral is a monster, a man with a criminal soul, a man who is morally vacant and who is therefore a profound threat to the very fabric of society. This is the great and the absurd logic of the trial. Mirso is not being condemned for ending a man's life. He is being condemned for his honesty, for his refusal to perform the expected and the socially required rituals of grief. He is being condemned for not playing the game, for not telling the comforting lies that society demands of its members. His crime is not murder. His crime is that he has refused to participate in the great collective illusion of meaning that everyone else has agreed to live by. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a fascinating and a deeply troubling spectacle. The court is not, in fact, concerned with justice or with the consequences of the actual crime. It is concerned with upholding a set of social conventions and a moral narrative that it believes are necessary for the well-being and the stability of the community. Mirso, in his radical honesty, is a threat to this stability. And so, for the greater good of the herd, for the preservation of their shared illusions, he must be eliminated. It is a form of social utility that is purchased at the cost of individual truth. Mirso, for the most part, is a passive observer at his own trial. He feels, he says, that he is an outsider, an intruder. It is only at the very end, as his fate is being decided, that he finally begins to awaken. He understands that this entire performance has nothing to do with him, that they are talking about a fictional character they have created, and he feels for the first time a profound and a deep desire to speak, to explain the simple, absurd, and an unexplainable truth of his own heart. But it is too late. The machine of human justice is already in motion. He is, of course, found guilty and is sentenced to be executed. And it is here, in the final chapters of the novel, in the face of his own certain and an impending end, that Mirso finally and truly awakens. He moves from being an unconscious and a passive, absurd man to being a conscious and a defiant, absurd hero. He is, for the first time in his life, forced to confront the ultimate meaning or the ultimate meaninglessness of his own existence. His final confrontation is with the prison chaplain, who comes to his cell to offer him the comforts of a religious faith. The chaplain speaks of God, of an afterlife, of sin, and of repentance, trying to give Marsault a final comforting story to make sense of his life and his death. But Marsault, who has lived his entire life without illusion, refuses this final and this most profound of all illusions. He is not interested in another world. He is interested in the one true and the beautiful world that he is about to lose. He explodes in a final great burst of rage and of passion. He grabs the chaplain and he shouts at him, pouring out all of his own dark and his own certain truths. He tells him that nothing, absolutely nothing, matters, and that he, Marsault, is just as certain of his truth, the truth of his one and his only life, as the chaplain is of his. He has lived his life in a certain way, and he could have lived it in another. But it all comes to the same meaningless end. It is a final and a furious rejection of all transcendent hope. After the chaplain leaves, a great and a profound peace descends upon Marsault. He has emptied himself of all his anger and all his false hope, and he is left alone in the silence of his cell to await his end. And it is here, in this final moment, that he has his great and his final revelation. He opens his heart, for the first time, to the tender indifference of the world. He recognizes that the universe is just like him, that it is a thing of beautiful and of silent and of profoundly uncaring indifference, and in this recognition he feels a strange and a brotherly kinship with it. He understands that he has been happy, and that he is happy still, and for his final and his ultimate act of rebellion, his final act of scorn against the society that has condemned him for his honesty, he hopes that on the day of his execution there will be a huge crowd of spectators, and that they will greet him with cries of hate. It is his final and his defiant embrace of his own status as a stranger, an outsider, a man who has chosen the difficult and the honest truth of a meaningless world over the comforting and the hypocritical lies of the human herd. He has, in the end, become the conscious and the lucid, absurd hero that Sisyphus represents. He has looked at his own meaningless fate, and he has not flinched. He has not escaped into a false hope. Instead, he has accepted it. He has embraced it, and in that conscious and that defiant acceptance, he has found a strange and a profound and a deeply human form of happiness, a happiness that is rooted not in illusion, but in the beautiful and the terrible truth of a world without appeal. In his early works, The Myth of Sisyphus and the Stranger, Albert Camus gave us a powerful and a deeply personal vision of a solitary individual confronting a meaningless universe. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, after his own experiences in the French Resistance, his philosophy began to evolve, to mature, and to move from a focus on the lonely I to the more compassionate and the more difficult problem of the collective we. This great shift is beautifully and tragically explored in his masterpiece, the 1947 novel, The Plague. The story is set in the ordinary and a slightly boring coastal city of Oran in Algeria, a town whose citizens are preoccupied with commerce, with routine, and with the small, unthinking habits of their daily lives. But one day, this ordinary reality begins to crack. Rats, thousands of them, begin to emerge from the shadows to die in the open. And soon after, the people of the town begin to fall ill with a terrible and a deadly sickness. The authorities are reluctant to name it. But the town's most clear-sighted doctor, Bernard Rieu, knows what it is. It is the plague. The city gates are closed, and the entire population is sealed off from the outside world, placed in a state of collective exile. The plague, in the novel, is not just a biological disease, it is a profound and a powerful metaphor. It is the concrete, the undeniable, and the inescapable manifestation of the absurd itself. It is a senseless, a random and an indifferent force of nature that descends upon the town without reason, without justification, and without any concern for the hopes, the dreams, or the merits of its individual victims. The plague is the ultimate symbol of a world that is not governed by a benevolent divine plan. It is a physical refutation of all the comforting illusions that the townspeople had lived by. It forces them, for the very first time, to confront the fundamental and the terrifying precariousness of their own existence. In the face of this absurd and this collective calamity, all the old, individualistic concerns, the pursuit of personal happiness, the worries about careers and about love affairs, are suddenly rendered meaningless and trivial. At the beginning of the quarantine, the primary feeling of the townspeople is that of personal exile. Each person feels that their own individual suffering is a unique and a terrible injustice. They are trapped, separated from loved ones in other cities, and they live in a state of hopeful denial, clinging to the belief that the plague is just a temporary nightmare, a bad dream from which they will soon awaken. They are, in this first stage, still trapped in the concerns of the self, unable to see that their personal tragedy is in fact a shared and a collective fate. From a utilitarian perspective, the plague represents a state of catastrophic disutility. It is a force that produces the maximum possible amount of suffering, of fear, and of death, while completely destroying the foundations of a happy and a functioning society. The entire novel can be seen as a grand thought experiment, asking the question, in the face of such an overwhelming negative force, what is the most effective and a most humane way to respond in order to mitigate suffering and to preserve human dignity? The novel follows a handful of central characters as they each grapple with this new, absurd reality. There is the journalist, Raymond Rambert, who is a visitor to the town and is desperate to escape. He believes that his personal happiness, his love for a woman in Paris, is more important than the collective suffering of the city. There is the minor civil servant, Joseph Grand, a man who spends his nights trying and failing to write the first sentence of a perfect novel, a quiet hero of the absurd, who finds his meaning in a small and a seemingly futile act of creation. And there is the mysterious visitor, Jean Theroux, a man who keeps a diary, a man who is a keen and a compassionate observer of the human condition, and who has spent his entire life wrestling with the problem of suffering. But at the very center of the story, the man who serves as the novel's moral compass, is the doctor, Bernard Rieu. He is a quiet, a practical, and a deeply decent man, an atheist who does not believe in God, but who believes, with an unwavering conviction, in his duty as a healer. Rieu is the first to recognize the plague, the first to speak its name, and the first to understand what must be done. He does not waste his time complaining about the injustice of the situation. He does not retreat into despair, and he does not seek a false comfort in any religious or a philosophical explanation. His response is a simple, a practical, and a deeply human one. There is a sickness, and his job is to fight it. It is a battle he knows he will probably lose, but one that he feels he must fight anyway. He is the embodiment of Camus's absurd man, but he is a new and a more mature version. His rebellion is not the solitary and the almost an artistic rebellion of a Sisyphus or a Marcel. It is a practical, a tireless, and a deeply compassionate rebellion against the meaningless suffering that has engulfed his entire community. His struggle is not for his own personal and a defiant happiness, it is for the simple and the shared dignity of his fellow human beings. The plague, then, is the great and a terrible event that forces the citizens of Oran and the reader to move beyond the individualistic concerns of the stranger and to confront a new and a more difficult question. In a world that is defined by a shared and an inescapable condition of absurd suffering, what are our duties to one another? Is it enough to simply cultivate our own personal rebellious freedom, or does the absurd itself call us to a new and a more compassionate form of collective action? The first part of the novel is the diagnosis of the sickness, the description of a town and of a humanity that is trapped in a state of exile, of fear, and of a profound and a deeply selfish loneliness. But as the plague continues its relentless and its indifferent march, a slow and a quiet and a beautiful transformation will begin to take place. The isolated individuals will begin to realize that the only way to fight against the absurdity of their shared fate is to fight against it together. A new and a powerful and a deeply human spirit of solidarity is about to be born. The city of Oran is now a city of ghosts, a population sealed off from the world, trapped in the long, monotonous, and a deeply lonely exile of the plague. The initial shock has given way to a quiet and a weary despair, and the citizens have been stripped of their old individualistic hopes and their personal ambitions. It is in this very crucible of shared suffering, however, that a new and a more profound human possibility begins to emerge. This is the great and the central theme of the second half of the novel, the slow, the difficult, and the beautiful birth of solidarity. The catalyst for this change is the journalist, Raymond Rambert, who has spent the first part of the epidemic trying desperately to escape the city. He has pulled every string. He has contacted smugglers. He has argued that his personal happiness, his love for a woman in Paris, gives him a special right to leave. But as his escape plans are about to finally succeed, he has a profound change of heart. He looks at the tireless and the selfless work of the doctor, Ryu, and the other volunteers, and he feels a sudden and an unfamiliar sense of shame. It may be shameful to be happy by oneself, he tells Ryu, and in this one simple sentence he announces his decision to stay, to give up his personal quest for happiness and to join in the common struggle against the plague. His decision marks the great ethical turning point of the novel, the moment when the solitary and the individualistic I begins to transform into the compassionate and the collective we. It is the discovery that there can be no true and no lasting personal happiness that is built upon an indifference to the suffering of others. The great organizer of this new collective spirit is the mysterious and the deeply thoughtful visitor to the town, Jean Taru. It is he who comes to Dr. Ryu with a practical plan to organize sanitary squads of civilian volunteers to help fight the plague. His reasoning is not based on any grand religious or a political ideology. It is a simple and a deeply human logic. The plague, he says, is everybody's business, and therefore everyone must do their duty. It is a call to a shared and a practical humanism. And so, the sanitary squads are formed. They are a small army of ordinary people, of men like the quiet civil servant Joseph Grand, who in the face of this overwhelming and an almost a cosmic catastrophe, choose to perform their small, their often a thankless, and their deeply necessary daily tasks. They keep the records, they disinfect the houses, they transport the sick. They are not grand heroes, they are simply decent human beings who have decided that the only way to fight against the absurd is with common decency, with honesty, and with a commitment to their fellow man. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a profound and a deeply moving discovery. In the face of a force that is causing the maximum possible amount of suffering, the characters discover that the most effective response is the cultivation of a universal compassion and a commitment to the common good. They are, without any grand theory, creating a system that is designed to maximize well-being in the midst of a crisis. Their solidarity is the most useful and the most practical of all possible human virtues. It is the only thing that can truly combat the disutility of the plague. The spiritual heart of this new solidarity is found in a beautiful and a quiet conversation between Ryu and Taru. The two men, exhausted from their work, go for a swim in the sea at night. In the cool, clean water, under the silent, starry sky, they experience a brief and a perfect moment of peace and of friendship, a temporary truce in their long and their endless war against the plague. And it is here that Taru confesses his own personal philosophy, his own search for a kind of secular sainthood. He tells Ryu that he has spent his entire life wrestling with the problem of the plague, not the literal, biological one, but the metaphorical plague, the plague of human evil, of injustice, and of the human capacity to inflict suffering upon others. He has learned, he said, that we all have the plague within us, that no one is immune to it, and that the only thing a person can do is to try, through a constant and a vigilant effort, to not breathe it into the face of others, to be on the side of the victims, not the pestilent. His great and a deeply humble ambition, he confesses, is to become a saint without God, a person who, without the comfort of any religious or a metaphysical hope, still chooses to dedicate his life to the difficult and the often acute work of reducing the suffering of his fellow human beings. It is a vision of a purely secular and a deeply compassionate humanism, a morality that is grounded not in a divine command, but in a simple and a profound sense of shared human dignity. Ryu, the atheist doctor, understands him perfectly. His own motivation is the same. He does not believe in a God who would allow a world where innocent children suffer, but his rejection of God does not lead him to a state of nihilistic despair. On the contrary, it fuels his determination to fight. His work as a doctor, he says, is a never-ending battle against creation. As it is his way of saying no to a universe that is governed by sickness and by death. His rebellion is his only way of being true to his own human heart. This is the great and the mature vision of rebellion that Camus presents in The Plague. It is no longer the solitary and the almost a prideful rebellion of Sisyphus, a man who finds his own personal happiness in his lonely defiance. It is a new, a more humble and a far more compassionate rebellion. A rebellion that is undertaken not for the sake of the self, but for the sake of others. A rebellion that finds its meaning not in a solitary I, but in a collective and a deeply connected we. The lesson of the plague, then, is a simple and a profound one. It is that the absurd in the form of collective suffering can only be fought through a collective response, through solidarity, through compassion, and through a love that is not a grand romantic passion, but is the quiet and the tireless work of common decency. It is the discovery, as Ryu concludes at the end of the novel, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. The long and the terrible and the monotonous reign of the plague is finally coming to an end. The disease, as inexplicably and as unreasonably as it arrived, begins to retreat. The death toll lessens, the city gates are opened, and the citizens of Oran are finally reunited with their loved ones and with the outside world. A great and a joyful and a deeply human celebration erupts in the streets, a celebration of life, of love, and of a return to the simple and the beautiful and the now incredibly precious routines of an ordinary existence. But for our heroes, for the men who have been at the very heart of the struggle, this ending is not a simple or a happy one. It is a time of profound and of deeply personal loss. The journalist, Rambert, is reunited with his wife, but he knows that his own personal happiness will forever be shadowed by the memory of the collective suffering he has witnessed. And for Dr. Rio, the end of the plague brings his own, most terrible personal tragedy, his quiet and his heroic friend, Shan Taro, contracts the disease in its final days and perishes after a long and an agonizing struggle. The passing of Taru is the final and the most poignant testament to the absurd. There is no rhyme or reason to it. He was the man who fought the hardest, who organized the resistance, who lived his life according to a profound and a deeply held moral code, and yet he is taken, while countless others, who were less noble, are spared. His end is not a reward or a punishment. It is simply a meaningless and a tragic and an accidental event, a final cruel reminder that the universe does not operate according to our human sense of justice. It is in the wake of this great and this final loss that Ryu sits down to write the chronicle that we have just been reading, and he reveals his own, deeply humble motivation. He has written this story, he says, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, and to state simply that what we learn in a time of pestilence is that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. It is a final and a powerful testament to his belief in a quiet and a compassionate humanism. This, then, is the great and the hard-won wisdom of the novel. The world is, and always will be, a place of absurd and of meaningless suffering, a place of plagues, of exiles, and of the senseless loss of innocent lives. We cannot hope to defeat this condition. We cannot hope for a final and a permanent victory over the forces of pestilence and of death, but we can, in the midst of this struggle, choose to bear witness, to fight, and to affirm our shared human dignity through acts of compassion and of solidarity. From a utilitarian perspective, the novel offers a profound and a deeply practical lesson in the face of a catastrophe that produces immense and widespread suffering. The only effective and a truly moral response is the cultivation of a universal benevolence. The characters who achieve a meaningful existence are not the ones who pursue their own selfish happiness, but are the ones who dedicate themselves to reducing the suffering of others. The novel is a powerful argument that the greatest human good, the highest form of well-being, is to be found in the service of the community. The ultimate hero of this new and this more mature vision of rebellion is the figure that Toru aspired to be, the saint without God. This is Camus's final, and his most beautiful, ideal, a new kind of hero for a godless and an absurd age. The secular saint is a person who does not believe in a divine reward, who has no hope for an afterlife, but who, nonetheless, chooses to dedicate his one and his only life to the difficult and the often a futile work of fighting against injustice and of healing the wounds of the world. He is not motivated by a desire for heavenly glory, but by a simple and a profound empathy for his fellow human beings. His sainthood is not a matter of purity or of piety, it is a matter of practice, of the daily, the difficult, and the often a very weary commitment to being on the side of the victims. His is a profoundly humanistic and a deeply compassionate form of moral excellence, a goodness that is all the more precious because it is practiced without the comfort of any divine or a metaphysical guarantee. But the novel does not end on a note of simple and of easy triumph. As Rio watches the joyful crowd celebrating their liberation, he is not swept up in their happiness. He is aware of a truth that they have already begun to forget. He knows, he says, what this happy crowd does not know, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, and that the day would come when for the bane and the enlightening of men it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. This is the final, and the somber, and the deeply realistic warning of the novel. The absurd, the capacity for suffering, the potential for evil, is a permanent and an inescapable part of the human condition. We can fight it, we can hold it at bay for a time, but we can never ever completely vanquish it. The struggle against the plague is a never-ending one, and our victories will always be temporary, and they will always be threatened. And so, The Plague is a book that is at once deeply pessimistic and profoundly hopeful. It is pessimistic in its honest and its unflinching recognition of the absurd and the permanent nature of human suffering. But it is hopeful in its quiet and its powerful and its deeply moving testament to the human capacity for goodness, for compassion, and for solidarity in the very face of that suffering. It is a book that teaches us that even in the darkest of times, even in a world without God, we can still choose to be human. It is the great central pillar of Camus' entire philosophy, the moment when his thought moves from the solitary defiance of the individual to the compassionate rebellion of the community. It is a profound and a timeless meditation on how we ought to live together in a world that is, and always will be, defined by our shared and our beautiful and our tragic and our absurd mortal fate. In his great novel, The Plague, Albert Camus discovered a profound and a deeply humanistic truth, that in the face of a shared and an absurd fate, the most meaningful response is not a solitary defiance, but a compassionate and a collective solidarity. But this discovery, born from the narrative of a fictional story, demanded a more rigorous and a more philosophical exploration. Camus needed to build a formal, intellectual foundation for this new and this more social form of rebellion, and the result was his most ambitious, his most controversial, and his most important work of nonfiction, The Night. This book is Camus's great and a final attempt to find a path out of the nihilistic abyss, a path that avoids both the false comfort of a leap of faith and the dangerous anything is permitted logic that had led to the totalitarian horrors of the 20th century. He is searching for a morality, a philosophy of limits, that can guide our actions in a world without God, and he finds the source of this new morality in the single and the most fundamental of all human experiences, the act of rebellion. The book begins with a simple and a powerful analysis of the psychology of the rebel. What happens, he asks, when a slave who has always obeyed his master's commands suddenly and inexplicably says no? In that single and that powerful no, something new is born. The slave is not just rejecting his master's authority, he is, for the very first time, affirming a value within himself. He is drawing a line in the sand, a boundary, and he is declaring that there is something within him that is more precious than his own life, a dignity that cannot be violated. This is the great and the creative power of rebellion. It begins as a pure and a negative act of rejection, but it simultaneously gives birth to a new and a positive value. The rebel, in his act of saying no to an oppressive condition, is implicitly saying yes to the principle of human dignity, of justice, and of freedom. He is no longer a silent and a passive victim of his circumstances. He is a conscious and a moral agent who has discovered a truth that he is willing to die for. And this leads Camus to his great and his beautiful central thesis, a phrase that is a direct and a deliberate echo of Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am." The rebel, in his moment of defiance, discovers that the value he is fighting for, the dignity that he feels has been violated, is not just a personal and a selfish feeling. He recognizes that this same dignity exists in every other human being, and so his personal rebellion becomes a collective one. He is fighting not just for himself, but for a value that is common to all of humanity. And this leads him to the great conclusion, I rebel, therefore we are. This is the profound and the humanistic foundation of Camus's entire political philosophy. The act of rebellion is what shatters our solitary and our individualistic existence and makes us a part of a shared and a human community. It is the very source of solidarity. It is the moment when the I of the lonely and the absurd man transforms into the we of a compassionate and a collective struggle. It is the birth of a new and a secular form of grace. A morality that is not handed down from a god, but is discovered in the shared and the defiant heart of man. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a brilliant and a deeply practical move. It provides a powerful and a non-religious foundation for a cooperative and a compassionate society. If the act of rebellion itself creates a shared value of human dignity, then we have a firm and a logical basis for a system of universal human rights, a system that, if respected, would lead to a massive increase in human well-being and a massive decrease in the suffering caused by oppression and by injustice. It is a formula for a happier and a more just world without any need for a metaphysical guarantee. Having established this foundation, Camus then divides his study of the rebel into two great historical traditions. The first is metaphysical rebellion. This is the rebellion of the solitary artist, of the prophet, and of the philosopher. It is a rebellion not against a specific political injustice, but against the very condition of human existence itself. It is the cry of the human soul against a silent, a meaningless, and an often a cruel universe. It is a rebellion against God, or against the absurdity of a world without God. The metaphysical rebel is the one who, like Ivan Karamazov, looks at the suffering of the innocent and declares that creation itself is unacceptable. He is the one who says no to the world as it is, and who, in his pride, tries to create a new and a better world in its place. This form of rebellion, Camus shows, is the source of our greatest art, of our most profound philosophies, and of our deepest and our most tragic spiritual dramas. It is the rebellion of a Cain, of a Prometheus, and of a Satan. He traces the history of this metaphysical rebellion through the centuries, from the dark and the transgressive fantasies of the Marquis de Sade to the passionate and the defiant poetry of the Romantics, and he sees its ultimate and its most brilliant and its most dangerous expression in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the great and the final metaphysical rebel, the one who took the rebellion to its logical conclusion, the one who not only rejected God, but who attempted to take his place, to become the creator of a new set of values. But in this great and this heroic and this solitary metaphysical rebellion, Camus also sees a profound and a deadly danger. For when the rebel rejects the world in its entirety, when he tries to create a new and a perfect justice of his own, he often ends up creating a new and a more terrible form of tyranny. The desire to create a perfect heaven on earth can, and often does, lead to the creation of a very real and a very bloody hell. This is the great and the tragic dialectic of rebellion. It begins with a pure and a noble yes to a shared human value. But it can, if it is not held in check by a sense of limits and of moderation, transform into a total and an absolute no to everything that exists. A nihilistic desire for total destruction or for the creation of a new and an inhuman utopia. This is the dangerous journey from metaphysical rebellion to its even more dangerous and its more bloody brother, the journey into historical rebellion. We have now arrived at the great and the tragic heart of Camus's study of the rebel. The moment when the pure and the noble act of defiance against an unjust creation begins to curdle into a new and a more dangerous form of tyranny. This is the story of metaphysical rebellion, the great heroic and an ultimately a self-defeating attempt by the human mind to say no, not just to a specific injustice, but to the entire and the flawed condition of human existence. It is a rebellion that begins with a cry for justice and often ends with a justification for murder. Camus traces the history of this great and this magnificent rebellion through a series of powerful and of literary and of philosophical figures. He sees its origins in the dark and the transgressive fantasies of the Marquis de Sade, who represents a rebellion of pure and of absolute individual freedom. A freedom so total that it demands the right to inflict pain upon others simply to affirm its own. Absolute power, he sees it in the passionate and the defiant poetry of the Romantics, who celebrated the solitary and the suffering and the misunderstood genius as a new kind of hero. But for Camus, the two most important and most consequential of all the metaphysical rebels are the two great thinkers who we have already met on our own previous journeys, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky and the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. In these two figures, he sees the culmination of the metaphysical rebellion and also the seeds of its terrible and its bloody downfall in the 20th century. They are the ones who took the rebellion to its absolute and its logical and its most dangerous limit. He looks first at Dostoevsky's great rebel, Ivan Karamazov. Ivan, as we have seen, is a rebel whose defiance is born not of selfishness, but of a profound and an almost an unbearable compassion. His rebellion is a rebellion on behalf of all the suffering children of the world. He looks at a universe that allows for such unforgivable horrors, and he says, no. His famous act of returning the ticket to God is for Camus one of the most powerful and the most noble expressions of metaphysical rebellion ever conceived. It is a cry for justice in a world where justice does not exist. But Ivan's rebellion, because it is absolute, leads him to a terrible and a nihilistic dead end. If he rejects God's justice, he must then create his own. And this leads him to the famous and the terrifying conclusion that everything is permitted. This idea, which is a cry of moral agony for Ivan, is taken as a literal instruction by his dark and his pragmatic double Smerdyakov, who then proceeds to commit the great and the unforgivable sin of patricide. Ivan, the noble rebel, becomes, through his own pure logic, the unwitting author of a sordid and a terrible act. This is the great and the tragic turning point. The moment when metaphysical rebellion, in its absolute negation of all divine law, opens the door to a new and a more terrible form of transgression, the logical crime. If everything is permitted, then not only is rebellion permitted, but murder is permitted too. Ivan himself cannot take this final terrible step. He is too consumed by his own conscience. His rebellion ends in madness, in a state of moral paralysis. But he has opened a door, and the next great rebel, Nietzsche, will be the one who dares to walk through it. Nietzsche, for Camus, is the most brilliant, the most courageous, and the most important of all the metaphysical rebels. He is the one who took Ivan's agonized cry of everything is permitted and tried to turn it from a statement of despair into a joyful and a creative declaration of freedom. He is the one who not only accepted the death of God, but who celebrated it, seeing it as the great and the necessary liberating event in the history of humanity, a chance to finally create a new and a more honest set of human values. Nietzsche's rebellion is a total and an absolute yes to the world that Ivan could not accept. He does not reject the world because it contains suffering. On the contrary, he embraces suffering as a necessary and even a desirable part of a great and a tragic and a beautiful existence. His great ideal figure, the Overman, is a being who is strong enough to live in a world without God, without transcendent meaning, and to create his own meaning, his own values, and his own justice, from the overflowing power of his own will. But Camus, while deeply admiring Nietzsche's courage, his honesty, and his profound psychological insights, also sees in him the final and the most dangerous stage of the metaphysical rebellion, for in rejecting God and the old morality, Nietzsche also seems to reject the very source of compassion and of limits that could prevent his Overman from becoming a simple and a brutal tyrant. The Overman stands alone, beyond good and evil, and there is no higher law, no principle of solidarity, to which he must answer. From a utilitarian perspective, this is the ultimate danger. A philosophy that places the creative will of a single, higher individual above all other concerns is a philosophy that can be used to justify immense suffering for the sake of that individual's greatness. It lacks any mechanism for ensuring the well-being of the community, any principle of shared human dignity. Camus saw that this heroic and this aristocratic individualism, if translated into a political program, could lead to a new and a more terrible form of slavery. The metaphysical rebellion, which began as a noble and a compassionate cry for justice in the heart of Ivan Karamazov, has now, in the philosophy of Nietzsche, reached its final and its most dangerous conclusion. It has destroyed God. It has torn down the old tables of the law, and it has placed a new God on the empty throne, the solitary, and the creative, and the absolutely free, individual will of the overman. It has, in essence, deified man himself. And it is this deification of man, this belief that a human being can become the absolute and the unquestionable source of all law and all value, that will, for Camus, provide the philosophical articulation for the great and the bloody political tyrannies of the 20th century. The metaphysical rebellion against God is about to transform into a historical rebellion against man, the lonely and the tragic. Defiance of the Creator is about to become the cold and the systematic logic of the executioner. We have now seen how Albert Camus traced the path of metaphysical rebellion, the great, heroic, and an ultimately a self-defeating attempt by the human spirit to say no to God and to the very conditions of creation. We saw how this rebellion, which began with a noble cry for justice in the heart of Ivan Karamazov, reached its final and its most dangerous conclusion in the philosophy of Nietzsche, the man who not only rejected God, but who attempted to put the overman in his place. Now Camus takes the next, and the most terrible step in his great argument. He shows us what happens when this metaphysical rebellion, this desire to create a new, a perfect, and a godless world, descends from the lofty heights of philosophy and enters the bloody and the chaotic arena of history and of politics. This is the story of historical rebellion, the story of the great modern revolutions that have been carried out not in the name of God, but in the name of man, in the name of a future and a perfect earthly paradise. It is a story that begins with a promise of absolute justice and ends with a reality of absolute tyranny. The great turning point, for Camus, is the French Revolution, specifically the moment when the Jacobins, led by figures like Saint-Just, take control. The early part of the revolution was a rebellion in the true Camusian sense. It was a no to the divine right of kings and a yes to a new and a shared human value, the principle that all men have a right to justice and to freedom. But this noble and this limited rebellion was soon replaced by something new and something far more dangerous. The Jacobins were not content to simply limit the power of the king. They wanted to destroy the old world entirely and to create a new one, based on the abstract and the divine will of the people, as articulated by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They took an abstract principle, the principle of absolute virtue, and they tried to impose it on the messy and the imperfect reality of human society. And to achieve this perfect, virtuous republic, they decided that any and all means were justified. This is the birth of what Camus calls logical crime. It is a new kind of transgression, a transgression that is not committed out of passion or greed or hatred, but is committed coldly and logically, and with a perfectly clear conscience in the name of a future good, the Jacobins, in the name of the future happiness of the French people, unleashed the terror. They sent thousands of their fellow citizens to the guillotine, not because they were criminals, but because they were obstacles to the creation of a perfect world. They had sacrificed real living human beings on the altar of an abstract and an unreal idea. From a utilitarian perspective, this is the ultimate and the most profound perversion of the very principle of utility. It is a form of moral calculus that allows for an infinite amount of present-day suffering, for the torture and the death of real, feeling human beings to be justified by the promise of a perfect and a completely hypothetical future happiness. It is a system that sacrifices the well-being of the present generation for the sake of a generation that does not yet exist, a monstrous and a deeply irrational form of moral accounting. Camus sees this same deadly logic at work in the great atheistic and the scientific ideologies of the 19th and the 20th centuries. Particularly in the revolutionary Marxism that led to the Russian Revolution, he sees the German philosopher Hegel as the great and the disastrous thinker who provided the intellectual framework for this new and this more sophisticated form of logical crime. Hegel's philosophy of history, with its idea of a great and a necessary and a rational force of spirit marching towards a final and a triumphant end, allowed the revolutionary to see himself as an instrument of historical necessity. The revolutionary Marxist, like the Jacobin before him, believes that he is on the right side of history. He believes that he is in possession of a scientific understanding of the great and the inevitable laws of historical progress, and this belief gives him a license to commit the most terrible of acts, if history is inevitably moving towards the final and the perfect classless society. Then any action that speeds up that process, no matter how brutal, is not just permissible, it is a moral duty. The concentration camp, the political purge, the mass execution, all of these can be justified as the necessary, if unpleasant, midwifery of history. This is the final and the most terrible perversion of the spirit of rebellion. The original rebel, the slave who says no to his master, is a man who is affirming a value that is common to all people, the value of human dignity. His rebellion is a struggle for the living, and it is rooted in a deep and a compassionate sense of solidarity. But the historical rebel, the revolutionary, has betrayed this original spirit. He is no longer fighting for the living. He is fighting for a future and an abstract and an inhuman concept. The concept of history. He has fallen in love with an idea, and he is willing to sacrifice the messy, the imperfect, and the beautiful reality of the present world and the real living human beings within it, for the sake of that cold and that perfect and that lifeless idea. He has, in essence, taken the place of the God he has rejected. He has become the new Grand Inquisitor, a man who is willing to inflict an unimaginable amount of suffering on his flock, all for the sake of their own future and a completely imaginary happiness. Camus's great book, The Rebel, is a powerful and a deeply unfashionable call for a return to a more modest, a more human, and a more compassionate form of politics. It is a rejection of all the all-or-nothing absolutisms, of all the utopian ideology that have caused so much bloodshed in the modern world. He is calling for a philosophy of limits, a recognition that there are no perfect and no final solutions, and that any political project that claims to be able to create a heaven on earth will inevitably create a hell. His is a call for a rebellion that is rooted not in a historical prophecy, but in the immediate and the undeniable reality of our shared human nature. A rebellion that says no to injustice, but that also says no to the logic of the guillotine. A rebellion that understands that the means must be as just and as compassionate as the ends we are trying to achieve. It is a rebellion that finds its truth not in an abstract and a distant future, but in the difficult, the imperfect, and the deeply beautiful solidarity of the present. For many years, the two great titans of French existentialism, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, were seen as inseparable allies. They were the two most famous and most influential public intellectuals of their time, fellow travelers in the French Resistance, and united in their share in their godless and their deeply modern worldview. But beneath their public alliance, a deep and a philosophical and a temperamental rift had been growing for years. And with the publication of Camus's great book, The Rebel, this private rift would explode into a public, a brute, and a deeply personal war of words that would permanently end their friendship. The break between Camus and Sartre was not just a personal squabble, it was one of the most important intellectual events of the 20th century. It was a battle that laid bare the two great and the warring paths available to the leftist intellectual in the age of the Cold War, the path of historical revolution, and the path of a more limited and a more ethical rebellion. At its heart, it was a conflict between a man who was willing to justify violence for the sake of a future utopia and a man who was not. Sartre, at this time, was moving closer and closer to the French Communist Party. He was a man who believed that history had a direction, that the Marxist vision of a classless society was the necessary and the inevitable goal of all human striving. And he, like the historical rebels that Camus had just critiqued, willing to condone, or at least to excuse, the brutal and the totalitarian methods of the Soviet Union as a necessary, if an unpleasant part of this great and this historical march towards justice. Camus in The Rebel had launched a direct and a powerful assault on this very way of thinking. His critique of logical crime, his warning that the pursuit of a perfect future justice can lead to a present-day tyranny, was a direct and an unmistakable attack on the kind of revolutionary ideology that Sartre was beginning to embrace. Camus was, in essence, accusing his fellow travelers on the left of having fallen in love with the very same murderous and an absolutist logic that had driven the guillotine of the French Revolution. When the book was published, The official review in Sartre's influential journal, Le Temps Moderne, was not written by Sartre himself, but by a young and an ambitious acolyte named Francis Jensen. The review was savage. It was a condescending and a deeply personal attack that dismissed Camus as a naive moralist, a Boy Scout of philosophy. A man whose beautiful but a deeply unserious ideas were of no use in the real and the dirty and the difficult world of political struggle. It accused him of standing on the sidelines of history and a state of beautiful but ultimately an irresponsible inaction. Camus was deeply wounded by the review, not just by its tone, but by the fact that his old friend, Sartre, had allowed it to be published, and he wrote a long and an angry and a deeply personal letter in response, addressed directly to Monsieur le Directeur, to Sartre himself. In this letter, he defended his book, and he accused Sartre and his circle of having become the very thing they had once fought against. They had become the new dogmatists, the new high priests of a historical religion that was willing to sacrifice real living human beings on the altar of an abstract and an unproven future. Sartre's public reply was even more brutal, and it was devastating. He unleashed the full and the formidable power of his philosophical intellect against his former friend. He psychoanalyzed Camus. He mocked his origins, he called his rebellion a sentimental and a solemn affair, and he accused him of having a fear of history. He essentially painted Camus as a beautiful soul who was simply not serious enough, not tough enough to handle the brutal and the necessary realities of revolutionary politics. It was a complete and a total and a deeply personal annihilation. From a utilitarian perspective, this debate is a profound one. It is a conflict over the very nature of how we should work to improve the world. Sartre's position is a form of revolutionary utilitarianism. He is willing to accept a massive amount of present-day suffering, the disutility of the concentration camp and the political purge, for the sake of a promised and a much greater future good, the utility of the classless society. Camus's position is a more cautious and a more immediate form of utilitarianism. He argues that the certain and the present suffering caused by the revolution will almost always outweigh the purely hypothetical and the uncertain happiness of the future utopia. The break was final, and it was absolute. The two men would never speak again, and it marked a great and a tragic split in the intellectual life of a generation. On one side stood Sartre, the man of history, the man of commitment, the man who was willing to get his hands dirty, and even bloody, for the sake of a future revolution, and on the other stood Camus, the man of morality, the man of limits, the man who believed that no future paradise could ever justify the present-day reality of a concentration camp. He chose the living person over the abstract principle. It was, in the end, a battle between two different kinds of rebellion. Sartre's was a rebellion that was absolute, a total no to the entire bourgeois world, a no that he believed gave him the right to say yes to the revolutionary violence that would be needed to destroy it. Camus' rebellion was a more modest and a more difficult one. It was a rebellion that was born from a yes to our shared human dignity, and that yes then forced him to say no, not just to the injustice of the oppressor, but also to the violent and the inhuman methods of the revolutionary. Camus lost the debate in the short term in the highly politicized climate of the 1950s. His nuanced and his morally scrupulous position was seen as a betrayal of the leftist cause, and Sartre remained the undisputed king of French intellectual life. But history, it can be argued, has proven Camus to be the more prescient and the more profoundly wise of the two. The great revolutionary utopias of the 20th century, all in the end, collapsed into new and more terrible forms of tyranny, just as he had predicted. His lonely and his deeply unfashionable stand against the seductive logic of historical revolution remains a timeless and a necessary warning. It is a testament to a man who, in a world that was drunk on the promise of a perfect future, had the courage to remain sober, to remain human, and to bear witness to the simple, the difficult, and the deeply compassionate truth of the present moment, a truth that he would then try to ground in a different and a more ancient kind of wisdom. Having waged his great and his lonely war against the nihilism of his time, having rejected the false promises of both religious and of historical absolutism, Albert Camus now turns his attention to his final and his most difficult task, the task of building a new and a positive foundation for how to live. If we cannot have the absolute, if we cannot have the utopia of the revolutionaries or the heaven of the saints, then what can we have? What is the source of a modest, a human, and a durable form of meaning and of happiness? His answer is a return to his own spiritual homeland, a return to the Mediterranean mind. He draws a great and a profound distinction between two different traditions of thought. On the one hand, there is the Germanic and the Christian tradition, which he sees as the tradition of history, of metaphysics, and of a relentless and a dissatisfied striving towards a future goal. It is a tradition that is obsessed with the absolute, a tradition that devalues the present moment in favor of a future and a more perfect state of being. Whether that is the kingdom of God or the classless society, it is a philosophy born in the gray, the fog, and the historically tormented lands of Northern Europe. But there is another tradition, an older, a brighter, and in his view, a healthier one. This is the Mediterranean tradition, the tradition of the ancient Greeks, the tradition of his own, sun-drenched Algerian homeland. This is a tradition that is not obsessed with history, but with nature. It is a philosophy that finds its truth, not in an abstract and a future ideal, but in the beautiful, the sensual, and the eternal present of the world around us. It is a philosophy that is born not from a dissatisfaction with life, but from a profound and a grateful love for it. The great guiding principle of this Mediterranean mind is the principle of limits, of moderation. It is the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, who understood that all human striving must be balanced by a sense of measure. It is a rejection of the all-or-nothing logic that has driven the metaphysical and the historical rebellions to their bloody and their tyrannical conclusions. The Mediterranean mind does not seek to conquer the world or to remake it in its own perfect image. It seeks to live in a state of harmonious balance with it. From a utilitarian perspective, this is the very definition of a wise and a sustainable path to human well-being. The great absolutist ideologies, in their pursuit of a perfect and an infinite future happiness, have consistently produced a state of immense and of immediate present-day suffering. Camus's philosophy of limits is a call for a more modest, a more realistic, and ultimately a more compassionate approach. One that prioritizes the concrete happiness of living human beings over the abstract and the often a bloody perfection of a theoretical utopia. The Mediterranean mind finds its truth not in difficult and in abstract books, but in the simple and the undeniable realities of the physical world, in the sun, in the sea, and in the human body. It is a philosophy that celebrates the beauty of the landscape, the joy of a healthy body, the pleasure of a swim in the cool water. It is a deeply pagan and a deeply sensual wisdom that grounds itself in the simple and the recurring and the eternal cycles of nature, rather than in the linear and the violent and the forward-marching arrow of history. This love for the present, for the beauty of the fleeting moment, is the ultimate antidote to the nihilistic despair that comes from a world without a future promise of salvation. If you can find a kind of perfection, a kind of eternity, in the beauty of a single sun-drenched afternoon, then you no longer need the promise of a paradise that lies beyond the grave. This world, in all its tragic and its mortal and its breathtaking beauty, is enough. It is the only heaven we have, and it is the only one we need. This is not a simple or a naive or a hedonistic philosophy. Camus is not telling us to simply ignore the reality of suffering and of injustice. He is a man who is deeply and almost painfully aware of the absurd, of the plague, of the dark and the tragic nature of our existence. But his great and his final insight is that the world is both beautiful and absurd, and that a complete and an honest human life requires us to live in a state of constant and of loving tension between these two truths. The Mediterranean mind is the mind that can hold both of these realities in its consciousness at the same time. It is the mind that can look at the world and see both its heartbreaking and its transient beauty, and its profound and its incurable injustice, and it is a mind that chooses in the face of this great paradox, not despair but a kind of sad and a deeply courageous joy. It is the wisdom of Sisyphus, who, even in the midst of his eternal and his pointless punishment, can still find a reason to be happy in the simple, physical reality of his struggle. This, then, is the quiet, the modest, and the deeply humane vision that Camus offers us. At the end of his long and his difficult journey, He rejects the prideful and the self-deifying rebellion of a Nietzsche, which he sees as another form of absolutism, and he rejects the abstract and the historically driven rebellion of a Sartre, which he sees as a justification for tyranny in their place. He offers a rebellion of moderation, of limits, and of a profound and a grateful love for the world as it is. It is a call for us to turn away from the gray and the cold and the abstract ideologies of the North, and to return to the warm, the clear, and the sun-drenched wisdom of the South. It is a philosophy that finds its ultimate truth, not in the promise of a perfect future, but in the difficult, the beautiful, and the deeply precious reality of the present moment. It is a call to live and to love our one and our only life, with a sense of measure, of compassion, and of a profound and a deeply grateful joy. After the grand and the sun-drenched and the ultimately a hopeful vision of the rebel, with its call for a return to the Mediterranean values of moderation and of beauty, Albert Camus' final works take a darker, a more complex, and a more introspective turn. It is as if, having mapped the path of rebellion, he now felt compelled to explore the subtle and the modern forms of bad faith that prevent us from walking it, and the ultimate expression of this late and this more pessimistic vision is his brilliant and his deeply unsettling 1956 novella, The Fall. The entire book is a single and an uninterrupted monologue, delivered over several nights in a foggy and a dimly lit Amsterdam bar called Mexico City, a place that is described as being at the very heart of the concentric circles of hell. Our narrator and our guide through this modern inferno is a man named Jean-Baptiste Camus, a former and a highly successful Parisian lawyer who now refers to himself with a strange and an ironic pride as a judge penitent. Camus, in his former life, was the very picture of a modern and a secular saint. He was a celebrated lawyer who made a career of defending the poor, the widows, and the orphans. He was a man of immense charm, of great generosity, and of a seemingly an infinite compassion. He lived a life of perfect and of public virtue, and he took a profound and a deep and a satisfying pleasure in his own goodness. He lived, he says, on the very summit of humanity, a man in a state of perfect harmony with himself. But this perfect and this self-satisfied life was built on a foundation of profound self-deception, and the first crack in this beautiful facade appeared one night as he was crossing a bridge over the Seine in Paris. He heard the sound of a young woman laughing behind him, and then the sound of a body hitting the water. He stopped. He heard a single desperate cry, and then a profound and an endless silence. And in that moment, he did nothing. He did not jump in. He did not call for help. He simply stood there, trembling, and then he walked away. This single act of inaction, of profound and of almost a cosmic cowardice, becomes the event that shatters his entire world. It is the beginning of his fall, a fall from the grace of his own self-created and an illusory innocence. He begins to hear a mysterious laughter mocking him from the rooftops of Paris, and he is forced for the very first time to see himself not as the selfless and the virtuous hero of his own story, but as a frightened, a selfish, and a deeply hypocritical fraud. He realizes that his entire life of charity was not born from a genuine compassion for others. It was, instead, a performance, a way of feeding his own immense vanity, his own deep and an abiding need to feel superior, to be on the right side of the judgment. He didn't help the poor because they were suffering. He helped them so that he could enjoy the beautiful and the satisfied feeling of his own goodness. His entire life, he realizes, has been a lie, a magnificent and a theatrical and a deeply selfish performance, played for an audience of one, himself. This is Camus's brilliant and a deeply unsettling critique of the modern, secular humanist. Camus is a man who lives in a world after the death of God, but he has not escaped the need for judgment. Instead, he has placed himself on God's empty throne. He has become his own personal judge, jury, and savior. His is a world of pure and of narcissistic self-absorption, a world where even the most virtuous of acts is just a more subtle and a more sophisticated way of feeding the ego, the nafs. From a utilitarian perspective, Camus's original life was one of high utility. His actions, regardless of his selfish motive, produced a great deal of good in the world. He helped the poor and defended the innocent. But Camus, like Kant, is suggesting that the consequences are not enough. A life that is built on a foundation of self-deception, of bad faith, is a psychologically sick and an unsustainable one, and its eventual collapse will reveal a deeper and a more corrosive form of suffering. Having fallen from the grace of his own self-admiration, Camus devises a new and a more brilliant and a more diabolical way of living in this godless and this judgment-filled world. He becomes a judge penitent. His method is simple. He sits in this dark Amsterdam bar and he confesses his own sins, his own hypocrisy, his own profound and a deep-seated fraudulence. To everyone he meets, he paints a portrait of himself as the most selfish, the most vain, and the most cowardly of all men. But his confession is not an act of genuine repentance. It is a trap, for in confessing his own sins so freely, he is holding up a mirror to the person he is talking to. He is subtly and brilliantly suggesting that they are just like him, that all human virtue is a form of hypocrisy, that everyone is, at their core, a selfish and a self-deceiving fraud. And in the moment that his listener begins to agree, to see their own hidden hypocrisy reflected in his story, the trap is sprung. The moment they are united in this shared, and this cynical, vision of human nature, Camus is no longer the one being judged. He has become the judge. By placing himself at the very bottom of the pit, he has earned the right to declare that everyone else is in the pit with him. His public penance is a trick, a clever and a deeply cynical performance that allows him to once again climb to a position of superiority, the superiority of the man who is at least honest about his own dishonesty. The Fall is Camus' darkest, and his most complex, and his most pessimistic work. It is a profound exploration of the nature of guilt, of innocence, and of hypocrisy, in a world where the old, religious forms of judgment and of forgiveness have disappeared. Camus is a portrait of the modern intellectual, a man who is drowning in his own self-awareness, a man who has deconstructed all virtue and is left with nothing but a universal and a deeply cynical sense of bad faith. He is, in a sense, the final, and the most pathetic, and the most intelligent form of the nihilist. A man who has seen through every illusion, including his own, and who is left with only one, final, and a deeply perverse pleasure. The pleasure of judging a world that he knows is as guilty and as fraudulent as he is. He is a prophet of a new kind of hell. A hell that is not a place of fire, but a place of endless and of self-aware and of deeply ironic confession. After the dark and the almost suffocating and the deeply cynical confession of Jean-Baptiste Camus in The Fall, Albert Camus seemed to turn his gaze away from the corrupt and the foggy heart of Europe and back towards the vast, the silent, and the sun-drenched landscapes of his Algerian childhood. His 1957 collection of 6 short stories, titled Exile in the Kingdom, is a quiet, a profound and a deeply beautiful exploration of the spiritual homelessness of modern man, and of the difficult and the often a silent search for a new kind of kingdom. Each of the 6 stories is a portrait of a different kind of exile. It is a theme that haunted Camus his entire life. The feeling of being a stranger, an outsider, a person who is not quite at home in the world. His characters in this collection are all, in their own way, they are cut off from their communities, from their loved ones, from their own true selves, and from the natural world. They are searching for a kingdom, a lost paradise, a state of grace, of connection, and of a profound and a meaningful belonging. In the story The Adulterous Woman, a French woman named Janine, trapped in a loveless marriage, travels with her husband through the stark and the beautiful Algerian desert. She feels a deep sense of alienation from her husband and from her own empty life. But one night, she sneaks out of their hotel room and stands alone under the vast and the star-filled desert sky, and in that moment she experiences a profound and a mystical and a deeply sensual union with the natural world, a fleeting and a beautiful return to her true kingdom. In The Renegade, a Christian missionary goes into the desert to convert a tribe of brutal savages, but he is instead captured, he is tortured, his tongue is cut out, and he is broken. In the end, he renounces his old faith and begins to worship the tribe's fetish, a brutal and an unfeeling stone idol. It is a terrifying story about the silence of God and about a faith that, when confronted with the absolute and the overwhelming reality of senseless violence, can curdle into a new and a more terrible form of worship. The worship of pure and of brutal power. And in the most famous story of the collection, The Guest, a schoolteacher named Daru, living in a remote and a lonely schoolhouse on a high desert plateau, is given a terrible choice. He is ordered by a local policeman to deliver an Arab prisoner to the authorities in a nearby town. Daru is a man of conscience. He is disgusted by the prisoner's alleged crime. But he is also horrified by the thought of handing another man over to be judged and to be executed. It is a choice that violates his deepest sense of human solidarity. He refuses to make the choice. Instead, he takes the prisoner to a crossroads. He gives him a package of food and some money, and he points him in two directions. One path leads to the prison, the other leads to the desert, to the nomadic tribes, and to freedom. He leaves the prisoner to make his own choice, and then he returns to his schoolhouse, but when he arrives, he finds a message scrawled on his blackboard by the prisoner's comrades: "You have handed over our brother. You will pay for this." His act of compassion, his refusal to be a judge, has been completely and tragically misunderstood. From a utilitarian perspective, Daru's choice is a profound and a difficult one. By trying to preserve his own moral purity, his own sense of personal integrity, he has inadvertently created a situation that is worse for everyone. The prisoner is likely to be recaptured, the community is now in a state of violent unrest, and his own life is now in danger. It is a powerful and a tragic illustration of the immense difficulty of doing the right thing in a complex and a morally ambiguous world, a world where even our best intentions can lead to disastrous consequences. All of these stories are explorations of the modern soul, adrift in a world where the old signposts, the old values of religion and of tradition, have disappeared. They are portraits of men and of women who are living in a state of spiritual exile, searching for a new kingdom, a new sense of belonging, a new way to be at home in the universe. And for many of these characters, the kingdom is not to be found in a political utopia or in a religious paradise, but in a fleeting, a beautiful, and a deeply personal moment of connection. It is the connection that Janine feels with the vast and the silent and the starry desert night. It is the difficult and the tragic bond of shared humanity that the schoolteacher Daru feels for his prisoner. The kingdom is not a place, it is a state of being, a moment of grace, a brief and a luminous truce in the long and the lonely war of our absurd existence. It is a return, not to a heavenly fatherland, but to the simple, the beautiful, and the deeply precious reality of the earth itself. This collection of stories is also Camus's most profound meditation on the role of the artist in the modern world. The artist, like the schoolteacher Daru, is a solitary figure, living in an isolated outpost, on the frontier between the world of ordinary society and the silent and the mysterious world of nature and of truth. He is a man who is caught between two loyalties: his loyalty to his own personal vision and his duty of solidarity with his fellow human beings. The artist for Camus cannot be a simple servant of a political party or a religious ideology. He cannot be a judge. He must remain true to the difficult and the often unambiguous truth of his own experience, but he also cannot be a purely solitary figure, an arrogant genius who looks down upon the world from his ivory tower. He must, like Daru, share in the common lot of all men. He must accept the difficult and the often a very dangerous burden of human solidarity, even when that solidarity is misunderstood. The artist's kingdom, then, is a difficult and a lonely one. It is the kingdom of the exile, the one who stands apart, but who does so not out of a sense of superiority, but out of a deep and an abiding sense of love and of responsibility for the community he has left behind. His work is a constant and a difficult navigation between the silence of nature and the noise of men, between beauty and justice, between his solitude and his solidarity, a theme that Camus would explore in its final and its most personal form in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. In 1957, at the age of 44, Albert Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, becoming the second youngest recipient in the award's history. The honor came at a difficult time in his life. He was embroiled in the bitter and the public feud with Jean-Paul Sartre. He was struggling with the painful and the complex moral dilemmas of the Algerian War for Independence, and he was suffering from a profound and a debilitating case of writer's block. But the prize forced him to step onto the world stage and to articulate, with a final and a beautiful clarity, his own personal vision of the role and the responsibility of the artist in the modern world. His Nobel banquet speech and his longer lecture, Create Dangerously, are a magnificent and a deeply moving summary of his entire lifelong artistic and moral project. They are a direct and a powerful rejection of the two great and opposing temptations that he saw seducing the artists of his time. On the one hand, there was the temptation of art for art's sake, the idea that the artist is a solitary genius who has no responsibility to anyone but his own personal vision, a philosophy of the ivory tower. On the other hand, there was the temptation of socialist realism, the idea that the artist must be a servant of a political ideology, that his work must be a tool for the social and the political revolution, a philosophy of the propaganda office. Camus, with his characteristic love of balance and of moderation, rejected both of these absolutist positions. He argued that the artist is neither the solitary and the self-obsessed creator, nor the simple and the obedient soldier of a cause. The artist, he insisted, has a different and a more difficult calling. The artist, he declared, cannot put himself today in the service of those who make history. He is at the service of those who suffer it. This is the very heart of his entire vision, in a century that had been dominated by the grand and the abstract and the often murderous ideologies of fascism and of communism. Camus called for a return to a more humble and a more compassionate art, an art that is grounded in the real and the lived and the often a very painful experience of ordinary human beings. The artist's duty is not to the grand narrative of history, but to the small and the often a silent truth of human suffering. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a profound and a deeply important ethical stance for the artist. By dedicating his work to the truth of those who suffer, the artist becomes a powerful force for social good. He gives a voice to the voiceless, he shines a light on injustice, and he cultivates a sense of empathy and of solidarity in his audience. An art that serves the suffering is an art that contributes directly to the well-being of the community, while an art that serves a rigid and an abstract ideology, as the 20th century so horrifically demonstrated, can easily become a tool for oppression and for the justification of immense human misery. The artist, for Camus, must be a rebel in the truest sense of the word. He must say no to all forms of tyranny, whether they come from the right or from the left. He must refuse to serve the masters, the executioners and the dogmatists of his time. But his rebellion must be rooted in a profound yes. A yes to the beauty of the world and a yes to the shared and the suffering and the beautiful reality of our common humanity. He must be a servant of two, and often a conflicting mistresses, the mistress of beauty and the mistress of truth. I have not been able to renounce the light, he says, the light in which I was born, and yet my art has been forged in a constant battle against the darkness of my time. This is the difficult and the noble tension in which the true artist must live, a commitment to both the beauty of the world and to the suffering of its people, a love for the sun and a clear-eyed recognition of the plague. It is the very same difficult balance that his entire philosophy has been trying to navigate. The artist, therefore, cannot be a simple spectator. He cannot be a judge. He is embarked, as he says, caught up in the same messy and a difficult reality as everyone else. His work is not a luxury. It is a necessity, a way for both himself and for his community to understand their own time, and to bear the weight of their own history. His art is a form of shared bread, a source of spiritual and a moral nourishment for a community that is struggling together in the darkness. This is a deeply humble and a profoundly social vision of the artist's role. It is a direct rejection of the prideful and the solitary and the almost a godlike ambition of the Nietzschean artist tyrant, who seeks to impose his own personal vision on the world. For Camus, the artist is not a commander, he is a witness. He is not a legislator, he is a servant. His greatness lies not in his distance from the herd, but in his deep and his unbreakable and his compassionate solidarity with it. He concludes his great speech with a final and a beautiful declaration of his own personal artistic creed. He says that the writer's role is to understand rather than to judge, and to be the bearer of the beauty and the suffering of all. His generation, he says, a generation that has known the horrors of 2 world wars, of the concentration camps, and of the threat of nuclear annihilation, knows that it will not remake the world, but its great and its difficult task is perhaps even greater. It is to prevent the world from destroying itself. This is the final and the mature vision of Camus's humanism. It is a sober, a realistic, and a deeply courageous philosophy. One that has been stripped of all the grand and the often violent illusions of the ideologies of his time. It is a call for a more modest, a more compassionate, and a more human-centered way of living. A way of living that finds its meaning not in the promise of a perfect future, but in the difficult and the beautiful and the deeply necessary work of the present. The artist, for Camus, is the ultimate keeper of this fragile flame, the one whose work constantly reminds us of our shared dignity, of our common suffering, and of the enduring beauty of the world. He is the voice of the rebel, the heart of the community, and the quiet and the persistent and the necessary conscience of a dark and a difficult and an often an unbearable age. After the great public pronouncements of his Nobel Prize speech and the dark and the almost a theological complexity of the fall, Albert Camus, in the final years of his life, embarked on a new and a vast and a deeply personal project. He began to write what he intended to be his own personal War and Peace, a great sprawling and an autobiographical novel that would be a final and a definitive statement of his entire life and work. He called it The First Man, and it was a book he would never live to finish. In 1960, at the age of 46, Camus was taken from the world in a sudden and a senseless and a deeply absurd car accident. In the wreckage of the car, a briefcase was found, and inside it was the muddy and the almost an indecipherable handwritten manuscript of this unfinished masterpiece. It would not be published for over 30 years, but when it was, the world was given a final and a breathtaking and a deeply moving glimpse into the very heart of the man and of the artist. The First Man is a return, a great circular journey back to the world that we visited in the very first part of our series, the world of his Algerian childhood. The main character, Jacques Cormery, is a thinly veiled version of Camus himself, and the novel is a passionate and a deeply honest attempt to excavate his own past. To understand the boy who was born into a world of poverty, of silence, and of a brilliant and a beautiful and an almost an unbearable sun, it is an act of profound and of loving memory. The central quest of the novel is the search for the father. Jacques, like Camus, never knew his own father, who perished in the First World War, and he grows up in a world that is almost completely without a past, without a history, without a story. His mother is illiterate and almost silent, his grandmother is a harsh and an unloving tyrant, and his family has no great traditions, no books and no memory. He is, in a very real sense, the first man of his own lineage, a boy who must create himself from scratch, without the guidance of a father. He travels back to Algeria as a grown man to try and piece together the story of the man he never knew. He visits his father's grave, he speaks to old men who served with him in the war, and he tries to find some connection, some thread that can link him to his own lost past. But he finds almost nothing. His father remains a ghost, a mystery, a silent and an absent figure, and Jacques realizes that he must accept his own profound and his deeply unsettling fatherlessness. He must learn to be his own source, his own foundation. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a profound exploration of the conditions that are necessary for human well-being. The novel is a testament to the deep and the human need for a story, for a history, for a sense of belonging that is rooted in a family and in a community. Jacques' ground in his lifelong struggle is to find a sense of inner peace and of purpose in the absence of this traditional and this deeply comforting foundation. He must find a way to flourish in a state of profound and of personal exile. But the book is not just a story of loss. It is also a magnificent and a deeply moving celebration of the world that did raise him, the world of his mother and the world of the son. His portrait of his mother is one of the most beautiful things that Camus ever wrote. She is a woman of almost complete silence, worn down by a life of hard labor and of poverty. But for him, her silence is not a void. It is a source of a deep and an unconditional and a profoundly honest love. She is the embodiment of a simple and a humble and a deeply truthful existence. She is a creature of the present moment, a being who is so completely and so totally in harmony with the world that she has no need for the great and the often deceptive stories of the past or the future. Her love is not a thing of words, but of simple and of physical, present, and in her quiet and her humble and her uncomplaining dignity, Jacques finds a moral compass, a source of truth that is more profound and more reliable than any of the great and the abstract philosophical systems of the world. And then there is the sun, the great and the divine, and the ever-present reality of the Algerian landscape. The novel is filled with a profound and an almost a painful nostalgia for the physical beauty of his homeland, for the sea, for the beaches, for the brilliant and the unforgiving light. This is the true kingdom that we have been searching for, the one true paradise that is not in the past or in the future, but is here, now, in the simple and the beautiful and the deeply sensual reality of the physical world. It is a return to the great and the pagan joy of his youth. The first man is, in the end, an act of profound and of loving gratitude. It is an acknowledgement of the two great and silent forces that shaped him, the humble and the uncomplaining love of his mother, and the brilliant and the indifferent and the beautiful glory of the natural world. He realizes that he is not a self-made man, not a heroic and a solitary existentialist who has created himself from nothing. He is the product of this specific place, of this specific history, and of this specific and this silent love. It is a final and a beautiful synthesis of all his great themes. The absurd is there in the senseless death of his father, and in the silent indifference of the universe. The rebellion is there in his own lifelong struggle to create a life of meaning and of justice out of a world that offers none. And the love is there, not as a grand and an abstract ideal, but as a simple and a physical and an unshakable bond with the world and with the humble people who first gave him life. The book is an unfinished masterpiece, a great and a sprawling and a beautiful ruin, but in its very unfinishedness, it is perhaps the most perfect and the most honest expression of Camus' entire worldview. It is a testament to a life that is always in the process of being created, a story that is never truly finished until the very moment of our death, and it is a final and a beautiful and a deeply moving farewell to the world that he loved with all of his heart, the world of the poor and of the silent and of the beautiful first men of the sun. We have now reached the end of our long and our sun-drenched and our often a difficult journey with Albert Camus. We have walked with him on the beaches of his Algerian childhood. We have stood with him at the dizzying precipice of the absurd. We have watched him condemn a man for not weeping at his mother's funeral. We have fought alongside him in the desperate and the compassionate struggle against the plague, and we have followed him into the dark and the complex and the violent history of human rebellion. It is a journey that has shown us a mind of immense courage, of profound honesty, and of an unwavering and a deeply compassionate love for this world. So, what is the final and the enduring legacy of this great and a deeply human thinker? In an age of grand and of totalizing and of often a monstrous philosophical systems, Camus's great strength was his profound and his persistent modesty. He did not offer a final and a definitive answer to the great questions of existence. Instead, he offered us a moral compass, a way to navigate the difficult and the often a tragic and the morally ambiguous terrain of a world without God, a world without any fixed and any eternal signposts. His entire philosophy begins with a courageous and an unflinching act of honesty. The recognition of the absurd, the unbridgeable gap between our desperate human need for meaning and the universe's cold and its silent and its unreasonable indifference. But this recognition for Camus is not a conclusion of despair, it is a point of departure, it is the necessary and the sober and the clear-eyed starting point for any truly honest and a truly modern way of life. It is the clearing away of all the false hopes and the comforting illusions that prevent us from seeing our true condition. From this honest starting point, he builds his entire life-affirming philosophy on three great pillars: rebellion, freedom, and passion. His is a philosophy that calls us to say a constant and a defiant no to the meaninglessness of our fate, while at the same time saying a passionate and a joyful yes to the beauty and the richness of our one and our only life. It is a call to live with an intensity and a lucidity that is born from the very knowledge that this life is all we have, and that it is, in the end, enough. But his greatest and his most important contribution was his evolution from the solitary rebellion of the individual to the compassionate and the collective rebellion of the community. He moved from the lonely defiance of Sisyphus and Mirso to the profound and the deeply moving solidarity of Dr. Ryu and the fighters of the plague. He understood that, while we may live and we may die alone, the only true meaning to be found in our absurd existence is in the shared and the compassionate struggle against our common and our tragic fate. From a utilitarian perspective, this is Camus' ultimate and most profound legacy. He created a powerful and a non-religious foundation for a just and a compassionate and a flourishing society. His entire later work is a search for a philosophy of limits, a way to fight for justice and to reduce human suffering without falling into the absolutist and the utopian and the ultimately a murderous logic of the great historical revolutions. He provides a blueprint for a society that values both freedom and solidarity, a society that can improve human well-being without sacrificing human dignity. This is what led to his great and his tragic break with Jean-Paul Sartre. In an age when so many intellectuals were willing to justify the tyranny of the present for the sake of a perfect future, Camus had the courage to say no. He had the courage to insist that no future paradise, no matter how beautiful, could ever justify the present reality of a single and a suffering human being. He chose the messy, the imperfect, and the deeply precious reality of the living person over the cold, the perfect, and the inhuman logic of the abstract idea. He is, in the end, the great philosopher of human dignity, a dignity that he grounds not in a divine soul or in a grand historical destiny, but in our shared capacity for rebellion, for love, and for a clear-eyed compassion in the face of a meaningless universe. He is the great moralist of an immoral age, a man who, without the comfort of God, still found a way to articulate a profound and a deeply moving vision of a secular sainthood, the ideal of the saint without God. His final and his most personal works, from the dark confession of the fall to the beautiful and the nostalgic and the unfinished symphony of the first man, are all a testament to this difficult and this honest and this deeply compassionate vision. He was a man who never stopped wrestling with the great paradoxes of his own time, the paradox of the solitary artist who must also be a part of a community, the paradox of the lover of life who must also be a clear-eyed witness to its suffering, and the paradox of the man having found no ultimate meaning in the universe, still found so many profound reasons to live. He offered us no easy answers, no comforting systems, no final utopias. He offered us something far more valuable, a moral compass, a way of orienting ourselves in a world that has lost its old maps. He taught us to find our truth not in the heavens, but on the earth, to find our kingdom not in a future paradise, but in the fleeting and the beautiful and the deeply precious moments of this present life, and to find our purpose not in a lonely quest for personal salvation, but in the shared and the difficult and the noble struggle for justice and for solidarity with all of our fellow human beings. He was the ultimate rebel, a man whose entire life and work was a testament to his belief that even in a cold, a silent, and a godless universe, the human heart can still be a source of a stubborn, a courageous, and a deeply and a beautifully life-affirming warmth. A warmth that is, in the end, the only true and the only lasting light we have.